Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the first research seminar of the term for the School of Applied Sciences. My name is Dr. Chris Watkins, a senior lecturer in psychology and organiser of the seminar series. So we have 4 speakers scheduled this term, with a separate public lecture organised by myself and the Psychology Society on the 31st of March, 6 p.m. So please, we'll keep you updated on that in due course. A reminder, as usual, you can post your questions in the Q&A section of the chat. We'll have around about 10 to 15 minutes for questions if anyone has any for Jane at the end. Okay, so to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jane Ogden. Jane is a professor of health psychology at the University of Surrey, where she teaches psychology, nutrition, veterinary and medical students to think more psychologically about health. She has published 8 books and over 230 research papers, and her research uses mixed methods, some of which will be covered today, where Jane's talk will explore the psychology of physical symptoms. So Jane, thank you very much for coming to speak to us here at Abate today, and I will hand over to you and your slides just
brilliant.
now.
All right, well, thank you very much, everybody, if you're out there in the virtual world, for to come and listen to me talking about the psychology of physical symptoms. I've been doing research on aspects of mostly eating behaviour and obesity, I suppose, for about the last 30 years. But I think the core to a lot of what I've been doing has been looking at mind-body relationships. And I suppose the focus on eating behaviour has been grounded in an interest in hunger and the impact of psychological factors on that as a kind of biological process. And then over time, I've kind of broadened it out to look at physical symptoms to incorporate other kind of physical symptoms as well. So if it's all right with you lot out there, what you're going to get today is a fairly kind of broad brushstroke of a huge amount of my career, really, but a bit of a kind of, whiz through of various different studies, but looking at the physical symptoms and how psychology has an enormous part to play in them. And I suppose what I'm going to do is contextualise it within a kind of medical model of how people think about their bodies and how medicine thinks about their bodies, and then how similar this often is to the patient model. And then to look at what I think is a key role for psychology in terms of words and context and how they change the meaning of symptoms and also the experience of symptoms. Then to look at whether psychology is not only involved in changing symptom perception, but also whether psychology can be involved in actually creating symptoms out of nowhere in the first place. And I suppose, overall, this illustrates the real interaction between the mind and body. And then finally, I want to kind of consider why this is the problem, particularly for some kind of patient groups, and also for medicine, really, who still cling on to the idea that the mind and body are separate and that physical symptoms can only be real if we accept that they are physical and therefore not psychological. Just to give you a kind of bit of a background, a medical model of health and physical symptoms talks about diagnoses, prevention, treatment, medication, surgery and vaccinations. It talks about what the physical causes of these problems are in terms of lesions and hormones and chemical imbalance. And within that, it talks about the symptoms that the patient brings to the doctor. So the patient has a headache, it has tiredness, they have stomach problems or back problems. And then they talk about the signs, which are the laying on of hands, if you like, of the doctor to take blood pressure or temperature or to listen to a heart. And that kind of medical model seems to very much underpin patients' models of their own physical health conditions. So a lot of the work I've done on obesity suggests that a lot of people living with obesity very much endorse a genetic model of excess weight. They talk about their hormones and they talk about chemical imbalances. If you look at patients with pain, they'll talk about the damage that's happened to their knee or to their backs, and they'll focus on the physical damage again. If you talk about stomach problems, they talk about acid production and the physicality of what's going on in their bodies. And also with fatigue, we've heard about it through chronic fatigue, but also through long COVID. There's a kind of emphasis again on a kind of physical underpinnings of all of that. And this sort of came to me quite recently, really, through a kind of dilemma that we've had at the University of Surrey, and that one of my students wanted to look at the psychology of long COVID, which I guess we've all heard about. And I was interested in trying to explore long COVID through a kind of chronic conditions perspective in terms of things like health anxiety, social support, sense making, coping, adjustment, behaviour change, and all those kind of bog standard health psychology issues really, and how they apply to long COVID. And we got quite a lot of complaints through social media, and we were asked to take our study down. And the complaints came from patients experiencing long COVID because they didn't want their condition to be seen as a psychological problem. And this is just some of the kind of the wordings that they used, but they said we've got the world scientists looking at, and then they're very keen on biological underpinnings of the problem: viral persistence, autoantibodies, microclotting, autoimmunity, and they are the causes of long COVID. And they said that our work was pseudoscience, that psychology was nonsense, basically. And they asked, how can health anxiety possibly cause the patient to microclot their own blood? Which I don't have an answer to, but anyway, it was an interesting question. And also they said our research didn't believe the patient testimony, because the patients say, obviously, they have had COVID, they have long COVID, it's a viral problem, and that we need to go back to the first principle of believing that they are physically ill, and then we need to find an appropriate physical treatment. And I suppose what came to me from this really was that health psychology has been around for 40, 50 years. Psychosomatic medicine's been around for 150 years, looking at the relationship between mind and body, and yet we're still here in whatever year we're in, 2022, where people still want to differentiate between the mind and the body, and they think that we are saying that symptoms aren't real if we say they have some kind of psychological underpinnings. So today is to go through the research that I've done looking at the role of psychology on the physical body experience, and particularly looking at the role of words and the role of context, and how they can change the meaning of the bodily experience and actual physical symptoms. So I've been really interested in words, and I'm a great believer that individual words can change the way that we frame the world and see the world, and make sense of the world. And there's a great history of this. Wittgenstein said the limits of my language are the limits of my mind. All I know is what I have words for. J.K. Rowling also very clearly knew it, for those of you who are Harry Potter fans, and talks about Voldemort as being he who must not be named, because to give him a word, to give him a name, would give him greater status. And for any of you who are country music fans, will know that Johnny Cash also knew this, and in his fabulous song A Boy Named Sue, when he calls his son Sue, so I gave you the name when I said goodbye, I knew you'd have to get tough or die, and it's a name that helped you, make you strong. So the word itself transformed who he was going to be. So words are clearly important. Because words are so important, when you talk to people, particularly in the medical setting, it's very clear that words have very different meanings to different people. So I've done a whole series of studies looking at how words mean different things to doctors and patients. This was a study looking at the word obesity and what obesity means to people, to doctors and patients. We had just under 600 patients and nearly 90 GPs across the UK. And obesity meant something very different to the two groups. So the doctors are in blue, the patients are in red. And the patients think that obesity is caused by hormones, by metabolism, and by stress. And the doctors think it's caused by eating too much. If you look at what obesity means in terms of solutions, the doctors think that the solution lies with the patient, and the patients think that the solution lies with the GP. So that word obesity is meaning very different things to doctors and patients. And I suppose in essence, the GPs are saying it's not my problem, it's your problem. And the patients are saying it's not my problem, it's your problem. So they're pushing this problem backwards and forwards. But just the word itself means something very different. And I did a very similar thing with depression, looking at doctors and patients' views of depression, and doctors in blue, patients in red. And the doctors think that depression is caused by a medical problem and it should be treated medically. So interestingly, it's not that doctors have medical models necessarily and patients have non-medical models, because actual doctors like the medical model of depression and patients like the medical model of obesity. Also done it with health, looking at what the word health means to doctors and patients, and hugely varied differences across the board. But patients have a very, very wide, much wider, broader view of the notion of health and think it's to do with, your bowels, your energy levels, the smell of your urine, the hair, your sweat, your tongue, your weight. It's a bit like we're like animals or vets, or, we're looking after ourselves as being puppies and checking out how healthy we actually are. But words have very different meanings. top of that, not only do they have different meanings, they also change meaning, and they can be very kind of powerful in the way that they change the way that we see the world. And I remember we had our house built about 12 years ago. We had an architect in, and we had a very large double high atrium hall, with a double, so it was double height, and it had a balcony around the outside with bedrooms looking in. And she said she wanted windows or openings from the bedrooms down into the hall. And I said, I don't want openings. I've got stepchildren and they're grown up and they're going to be in there with their boyfriends and their girlfriends. I don't want to hear it. And she said, no, it's not a hall, it's a courtyard. And she just called it a courtyard. And when she called it a courtyard, I thought, actually, I can completely see what you're getting at, because actually, you know, they should be interconnected spaces and lights and all of that. We still didn't have holes. We actually had shutters, so we couldn't hear what my stepchildren were up to. But just the word from hall to courtyard made me think, actually, that's exactly what we want. So words change meaning. And this is just a fabulous example that I saw in Guildford about a year ago down in Debenhams. This is Johnny Depp advertising his aftershave, which is called Sauvage, which is all, you know, if you like loads and loads of tattoos and men who look like Johnny Depp, but it's all kind of very sexy and very chic, and you want to go and buy your Sauvage because that's what Johnny Depp is advertising. And then someone graffitiized it to say sausage, which I thought was just fabulous, because the single letter, not even word, totally transformed, and you just do not want to wear Johnny Depp sausage, really. So I thought that was very clever. Another example, this is an animal I used to see in France quite a lot, which I thought was a fabulously exotic French animal that I couldn't work out what it was. But anyway, it turned out it was a large rat. And I called it, I thought, well, actually, it's just a rat. And it was still the same animal, but it had a word to it. And then this was a debate that went on a couple of years ago, which I was very much kind of excited by, really. But when I had my children, who are now grown up, but I was very keen that they would have words for their bits, and there wasn't really a girl's word, and there was a campaign to say we need a word for girls to call their bits something other than vagina, because boys had willy and girls didn't have a thing. But the word itself obviously changes the way that we think about things. So words mean different things to different people, and they also change meanings of things. And in the context of health, then words also change how we feel about our health. So I did a study looking at the word heart failure. And heart failure is a condition where your heart's not pumping strong enough around your body, and it can cause swollen ankles, and it's a sign really of aging. And it's a horrible phrase, if you like, because it sounds quite dramatic and quite scary, and very obviously quite worrying. And so doctors often use a euphemism. So I wanted to know what's the effect of using the word itself versus the euphemism. We did an experimental design with a vignette. We had 447 patients, and they were either given a vignette with the word heart failure or the preferred euphemism, which doctors told me was your heart is not pumping hard enough. And then we looked at how that impacted upon their health. And you can see that one word, heart failure versus euphemism, made patients create a different representation of what that health threat actually was. So blue is heart failure, and you can see this was using an IPQ based upon the Illness Perceptions Questionnaire. But you can see that heart failure made them think that the condition had greater consequences, had a greater emotional impact, and it would last longer. Did a study looking at the word obesity. Obesity has now become quite a contentious word within the kind of patient world and the medical world. So we looked at the word obesity versus the euphemism. Again, we had 449 patients, and they were told that they had either obesity or they had the euphemism, and the preferred euphemism from the doctors was your weight might be damaging your health. And again, we looked at what's the impact of that, just simply that one word, on how people feel about their condition. And you can see the obesity made the patients think it had greater consequences and a much stronger negative emotional reaction. We then interestingly broke that down into our participants who either were living with obesity or not. And actually, it was the people who were living with obesity that had the less emotional reaction. So you can see on the left, the people with obesity are the red bars, and those with obesity thought using the word obesity would be less of an emotional negative impact, whereas it was the non-obese who actually thought it was a dreadful word to use. So I thought that was quite interesting. So the word itself has a different impact upon people, but actually it's the people who are not living with obesity that think the word obesity is worse, if that makes sense. Got into doing lots of studies like this because I just quite like playing with words. And we looked at tonsillitis versus sore throat, gastroenteritis versus stomach upset. We did a fabulous study, which was just really because it was quite good fun, but it was with a GP a long time ago. And he was interested in when you use words with patients, do you match the words that they come into the consultation room with, or do you use the medical word? So he said, I don't know what I should do. If someone says, you know, my willy hurts, do I say, oh, tell me about your willy? Or do I then use the medical word? You know, what should I do? Which is the best way to approach patients? So we did a study. It was a randomized control trial in primary care, looking at matched versus unmatched words. Actually, patients like to match words. We also looked at whether you should use person first language, like a person with diabetes, or you should use the word a diabetic. And also we looked at how doctors express uncertainty. Should they say, I'm not sure, which is verbal uncertainty, or behavioural uncertainty, which is I'll look it up. And what we found was that those words, those simple words, changed the way that patients felt about their condition. So tonsillitis and gastroenteritis made it feel much more serious than the lay version. Matched language made patients feel happier. Patients weren't bothered really whether they were told you are a person with diabetes or a diabetic, and patients liked behavioural uncertainty, I'll look it up, but they didn't like verbal uncertainty, which is I'm not sure. Words make a massive difference, and in my world, in the world of obesity at the moment, there's a big debate about whether obesity should be called a disease as opposed to a condition or a risk factor or a lifestyle. And across the world, most people are now endorsing it as a disease, and that debate is just still going on in the UK. But I've been arguing that we need to choose carefully because the word disease means something very different to the word condition or illness. Words are important, and words change meaning in the health context. But words also can change our physical bodies, the way that we feel about our symptoms. So what we label things as can actually change how we feel the symptoms that we've got. The example of my run on a campsite where I go running on holiday, which is great. And after a couple of years, I realised that actually it was a hill that I was running up. And then I started to call it a hill. And I don't know any of you out there in the virtual world are runners or not, but my feeling is when you start to think, oh my God, this is a hill, it actually gets worse. And I do parkrun every Saturday. And for those of you who know what a parkrun is, you run 5K with the whole of the world at 9 o'clock. And as I'm running around, some of the marshals say to me, go for it, you're coming for a hill, and then you'll be at the top. And I think, don't tell me it's a hill, just tell me I'm doing really well, because as soon as I think this is going to be hard, it then becomes harder. And we actually did a study to try and test this, and we got people on treadmills, and they were all running at the same levels on the treadmill, but half of them we told it was a hill and half of them we told it was flat. And then we wanted to see whether their experience was it was actually harder. And the data were a bit messy, which is why I haven't written it up. But we sort of found that people who were expert runners, i.e. not me, found it easier when they were told it was a hill, and people that were not so good runners, i.e. like me, found it harder when it was a hill. So just the word itself, for people like me, made it feel harder. In other totally different domains, the word again can change people's experiences of their recovery or their symptoms. So we did a qualitative study in people who'd had an abortion, and people use lots of words to describe what it is that they are having aborted, whether it's a fetus or a white dot on the echo or it or baby or child. And then we looked at different kind of changes over time in how people had adapted and came to terms with having an abortion. And sort of those people who became less upset over time seemed to use more neutral or more biological or less emotional words, like it's a fetus, whereas those who became more upset over time used more baby words. So they talked about it, my baby, and that seemed to then create a difference in their adaptation. Did a study last year with a student of mine on polycystic ovaries. And we were interested in what happens during the diagnostic consultation and the words that healthcare professional uses in that diagnostic consultation. how does that then translate into the future in terms of the impact of having polycystic ovaries? And this came from a very personal, most of my research is kind of autobiographical in some ways, but this came from a friend's experience of mine. And she'd had a dreadful diagnosis of her PCOS when she was told that her testosterone levels were very, very raised, almost in the level of a man, which is complete and utter nonsense. And he was quite shocked. So he kind of showed her his shock, and then he reacted in a very shocked way, and she found that very traumatic. But anyway, we looked at people, 146 women with PCOS. We asked them what words we used to diagnose your PCOS, how was the consultation carried out, and then we asked them about their current impacts, the quality of life. And what we found was that if they looked back and they said they felt really uncomfortable in that consultation because they weren't looked after or cared for by their healthcare professional, and they had used the word raised or irregular, then that seemed to correlate with an increased impact to PCOS now. So the use of those words back then and a lack of comfort or a lack of feeling being cared for then seemed to relate to the fact that PCOS had a greater impact on their life subsequently. And there's something about, judgmental words like abnormal versus neutral words, and something about, whether you think it's controllable, that you can do anything about it. But those words themselves seem to change the impact of the condition. And something completely different, and I do apologise that this is jumping around a bit, but it's not. There is a thread, but I've been interested in lots of various different things, and something else all about kind of how we sense the world, our bodies, and the role of words in all of that, really. But this is a little study that I did a long time ago when I worked in primary care, and I was quite interested in time perception. And I know that there is a literature out there on time perception, and I don't know very much about it or not. But I wanted to know, when a patient is in the consultation with their GP, they often come out saying, I want more time. And they all get, they get 7 minutes. That's pretty much what they get. And I wanted to know how that feeling of I want more time relates to what goes on in that consultation. And does what go on in that consultation make time go very slowly or very fast? And I guess I've always, been intrigued by time perception in some ways, because some things can make things, whiz past. I know when my children were very little and I'd be sitting on the floor playing train sets with them, sometimes time would be going like, you'd look at your watch and it'd be like 1.5 minutes later and you're still playing train tracks and thinking, God, how has time slowed down? So anyway, they all went into the consultations and we recorded real time, their guess of time and their preferred time and their satisfaction. In terms of whether they were accurate or not, 70% were accurate, over half underestimated how long they'd got, and only 31% overestimated. Thing that predicted whether they wanted more time was if a doctor had done a lot of talking. So the more the doctor talked, then the more the patient felt that the time had gone too quickly and they felt that they wanted more time. So I think being able to talk as a patient would slow down the time. So it's not so much about words per se, I suppose, but it's about kind of the use of that time in terms of conversation. So if a doctor spoke less, then the patient would feel more satisfied because they had actually been able to do the talking. So words change meaning, and they also seem to change symptoms. The other psychological factors which seem to also change symptoms are the context within which those symptoms happen. So something around the physical place, or something around distraction, something around the role of your cognitions. But the context within which you're having a physical body seems to also change those symptoms, again, highlighting the role of psychology. So this is my daughter. For anyone out there that's ever had my textbook, my poor daughter's had this in my textbook forever, but she's now 20 and would hate the fact that this is still in my slides. But I made her stand in the garden with a blue tack on her hand covered in ketchup and a fork stuck into it. But the whole idea behind this really was that if you the way you react to a child hurting themselves, the way you give them meaning for their pain, then changes how they feel about their pain. And I always thought the perfect model of why symptoms are psychological was if a child falls over, they look at you and you've got about 0.4 of a second to frame that, either in a positive way and go, oh, you'll be fine, up you get, it's nothing. or to say, oh, you poor thing, that must really hurt. And then the way you react then determines how they react. And then they either cry or they don't cry. Obviously, if their arm is hanging off, then you probably haven't got much chance to kind of reframe that. But you can change the meaning by the way you react, and then you can change the amount of pain they feel. And though over the years, I've taught pain for probably sort of 25, 30 years now, to try and look at pain perception. And I inflict a small amount of pain on all of my students every year using a leg raising task. So you're welcome to steal this if any of you are teaching pain. But you basically get your leg, sit on a chair with your bum against the back of the chair, and you lift your leg horizontally, and you do it for a minute. And then you get the students to put them into one of four groups, and they do a different thing, and it changes symptom perception. And they do it in pairs, and every year it works like an absolute dream to show that what you're doing during something which is painful changes the degree of pain. So they either focus on their pain, so they describe it to the person next to them. They chat about the weekend, what they're going to do, which is a distraction. They do a relaxation task where their partner helps them imagine that they're on a beach and the sea is lapping against the sand and they can hear the birds. Or they do nothing. Sorry, I can't see behind your little face icon in the corner. I forgot. I couldn't see what the final one is. But you can see absolutely every single year. They then say, how much does it hurt when their legs up horizontally for 1 minute? And focusing on it and doing nothing is far more painful than being distracted or relaxing. And I mean, I've done this task for GPs and surgeons and all the medical people that I teach, and it's a really good way of illustrating that pain can be massively reduced by not paying attention to it, and by paying attention to it then it absolutely increases. And then on a bigger scale, we did a study looking at pain during varicose vein surgery, and this again is a personal note, but I had my varicose veins done probably about 10 years ago now by a surgeon in Guildford, and it's quite a painful procedure because it's done under a local anaesthetic, and you lie there while he puts local anaesthetic in your legs, which really hurts, and then he pulls them out like with a kind of you sort of literally drag them out. It's a bit I always imagined in my head it was like a kind of bird pulling out worms from the garden, but that's what they do into your leg, and it's not very pleasant. And I said to the surgeon, surely you've got something that you can give me that will just distract me. Can I listen to music? Can I watch a film or whatever? And all he had, I just remember it, there was a plug on the wall that I was kind of facing, and it just said does not work. That was it. That's what I had. Anyway, he funded me. This is Mark Whiteley, funded me to do 2 PhD students, which was fabulous. And this was one of them with a student of mine called Bryony Hudson. And we ran a randomized control trial on pain reduction during varicose vein surgery. We had 5 conditions: listening to music, watching a DVD, chatting, so we just chatted to the nurse, touch, where you played with stress balls, or a control condition where we did nothing. And what we found was that pain was much lower. There's pain and anxiety, so blue is the pain, but pain was much lower in the social interaction, so the chatting group, and also the playing with the stress balls group. So during conscious surgery, simply playing with the stress ball made quite a big difference. To the BBC News, and I was very excited that I was going to, change the world as to how conscious surgery was done, but no one seems to ever use stress balls. But I just thought you could use them, dentists could use them. We have hysteroscopies, we have colposcopies, we have endoscopies, we have, vasectomies, we have so many operations which are done now consciously. Be a really simple intervention to use to try and reduce pain. Another little study that we did, again looking at the role of psychology on the physical body, and I love this study. I thought this was quite neat. It was done by Maggie Heinrich, who was a PhD student of mine, and the surgeon Amit Patel from King's used to do lots of laparoscopic keyhole surgery, and he wanted to know why people recovered quicker from laparoscopic surgery than from open surgery. Was it because of the actual surgery, or was it because of their expectations? So we tried to think of a way of mimicking the two, because you couldn't randomize to the two kinds of things, and we came up with the idea of pretending that they'd had more surgery than they had by the size of the dressing. So they either had a large dressing or a small dressing, after the operation, and then we followed them up. And findings were all a bit mixed, as they often are, but having a larger dressing, which I suppose made it feel like it had been a bigger operation, a bigger intervention, made them think it would take longer to recover. It reduced their health status, made them believe for some reason that the gallbladder problem was genetic, but it also reduced their stress. So they found comfort in having a larger dressing, but it changed the way they felt about their health. I mean, I suppose I'd thought that it would also change the pain, that if you had a big dressing, you'd feel more pain because you'd think, God, this must be a massive thing that's hiding under there, but it didn't actually change that. So that's the impact on symptoms. And then thinking about the stuff I've done on hunger. So the experience of hunger is a kind of classic mind-body relationship, really. So, you know, much as from a biological perspective, hunger might be about gut hormones or brain chemicals, you know, it's clearly a perception from my perspective, which is influenced by whether you focus upon it, by the same as pain, whether you're distracted from it, the same as pain, whether you're worried about it. So that changes the way that we feel about our bodies. So just to show you a few of our hunger studies, this was an experimental study that we did. We got people to eat. We had a bowl of hula hoops, and they ate either while they were driving. We used to have a driving simulator at Surrey, just half a car. You could sit in and the world moves around you, but we got them to drive whilst eating a bowl of hula hoops, whilst chatting to a friend when they were alone or when they were watching TV. And we just asked, you know, who ate the most. And I don't know who you'd predict would eat the most, but fairly predictably they ate the most when they were watching the telly. And that was to controlling for baseline hunger and controlling for when they had last eaten. So the process of being distracted by watching the TV seemed to make people eat more. But what was more interesting, I thought, was that if you ate while you were driving or while you were watching telly, the amount of food that went into your body didn't correlate with a decrease in hunger. So you'd imagine, you know, you put 300 calories into your body, your hunger would decrease more than if you only put 50 calories into your body, because the body is absorbing calories, therefore taking away your hunger. But if you're distracted whilst you're eating, then the food in doesn't correlate with a reduction in hunger or an increase in fullness. So something was happening to disrupt that kind of mind-body relationship. We also did a study on eating on the go. And there's obviously lots of concerns now that people eat at their desks, they eat in the cinema, they eat walking between meetings. And so we looked at when you eat when you're walking around versus watching telly versus chatting. And we found that we then tested how much they ate afterwards. And what we found was that if you'd eaten whilst you were walking around, then you ate far, far more afterwards. And it was almost as if when you were walking and eating, again, you weren't thinking about what you were eating, and therefore when that food went into your body, it didn't actually fill you up. So again, if you're distracted from the symptoms of hunger, you don't feel hunger in the same way. So all of that suggests that not only do words change symptoms, but also context changes symptoms. So then what I did was to try and put these two things together, and to think, is there a relationship between the words we use and the context? And putting those two together, does that also change the way that we feel about our bodies? And this was a study that we did a couple of years ago with some students, and we went to Tesco's and we bought a pasta pot, which was 320 calories. And then we gave people that pasta pot to eat, and we said to them, will you eat this? And half of them were told it was a snack and half of them was told it was a meal, but it was still the same pasta pot of 320 calories. And then we changed the context by getting half of them to eat it standing up as a snack out of a plastic pot with a plastic fork, or half of them to eat it sitting down at a table with a chair on a ceramic plate with a knife and fork. But all the time it was a 320 calorie pasta pot from Tesco's, but we just manipulated the word and the context. And then what we did then, after they'd eaten their 320 calories, we then took them next door and did a taste test to see how much people ate afterwards. And what we found was, so the blue is the people who were told it was a snack and the yellow is the people that were told it was a meal. afterwards, those people who'd been told it was a snack ate much more sweet foods, significantly more sweet foods. So they've all eaten 320 calories from Tesco's, but if they were told it was a snack, they ate more sweet foods afterwards. We then impact the context, and the blue is the snack, and again the red, the yellow, whatever colour it's coming up as, orange is the meal. And you can see that those who ate it as a snack, i.e. ate it standing up, ate more overall, so more total mass afterwards in the taste test. And then putting that all together, the people who ate the most were the light blue bars there, and they are the people that were told it was a snack and ate it standing up. So you can see that they ate more overall mass later on in the taste test, and they also ate overall more sweet foods later on in the taste test. Those are the higher bars, and you can see at the bottom it goes meal, 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 snack, 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 meal. That's what the key is. So the word snack made them eat more. The context of standing up eating as a snack made them eat more, and then putting those together, that's when they ate the most. So if hunger were a biological process, then the words you use and the context you use shouldn't change how much you eat or how hungry you feel, because you should eat according to your gut hormones or your brain chemicals or whatever, or the time that you've last eaten. But simply changing the way we label things seems to change how people ate. In terms of the psychology of the kind of the mind and body, then words change things and context change things, and you put these two together and again they change things. So, you know, it's a pretty obvious thing, and Freud knew this in 1892, but the mind and body clearly interact, and the way that we use words or the way that we change context influences our bodily experiences. And so my final question was really, if psychology can change symptom perception, can it actually create symptoms out of nowhere? So can it change symptom onset? And this was a study that we did a few years ago when we showed participants videos of either cold. So you can go on YouTube, you can find all sorts of videos these days, and this is naked people jumping into cold, icy pools in the Arctic or wherever it is, Iceland or whatever. We showed them videos of injuries, football injuries, boxing injuries, people breaking limbs and having horrible kind of arm and leg injuries. And then we showed videos of head lice. And we wanted to see whether watching other people experience symptoms can actually generate people's symptoms in their own bodies. And then we measured whether people felt cold, felt pain, or whether they itched. And we measured it self-report, but we also observed people. So we wanted to see whether when you watch head lice, do you actually then start itching yourself, because those symptoms are contagious. And we found exactly that, which I suppose feels kind of quite obvious really, but when people were watching the snow videos, they felt cold. When they were watching the injuries, they felt pain, and when they were watching the head lice, they said they felt itchy. And then when we watched them, I mean, by far the most effective was the head lice. So watching head lice just generates itchiness in your own bodies, but watching cold generates shivering as well. I'm not sure I quite believe the pain, because I think you can empathise with pain, but I don't think your body gives you pain from watching it. But shivering and definitely itching are extremely contagious physical symptoms that you can catch simply through suggestion. That's a huge number of bits and pieces which I've kind of woven together in some kind of hopefully coherent way to look at the role of psychology on the physical body, which, you know, to me seems obvious. The mind and body interact, and then specifically the words we use and the context we use actually change the meaning, change the experience, change the physical symptoms that we actually feel, suggesting that symptoms are psychological. I think at the beginning I sort of argued that medicine has a very medical model. My experience of working with doctors over the last 25 years has been that increasingly they do recognise that there's a strong psychological component to physical symptoms, and that when people come in, you know, with arthritis, with knee pain, with back pain, with wrist pain, or with chest pain, or with tiredness, then that has a psychological underpinnings to it. But it feels sometimes that patients are still quite resistant to seeing things as psychological, and they actually want a biological model. And I suppose, you know, going back to the study on long COVID, there's a feeling that by saying we're saying it's psychological, they feel that it's not real, and they don't want to accept that there is a psychological component in there. Of course, something still hurts, Of course, you are still tired. Of course, you still have those physical problems, but they have a psychological component to them. But they want it to be biological because that feels that it's more, endorsing of their experience. And that to me is a dilemma, really. This feels, fairly obvious. We've known this all for a long, long time. But how do we then get that message out to people, for them to accept that things have a psychological component, or they are psychological, but that still means they are real? Okay, that's me done. Thank you very much for listening. Are there anyone out there in my virtual world or any questions?